Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Wednesday, April 17th, 2024, and today we are going to be talking about President Biden now leading President Trump in national polls on average here, taking back the lead for the first time since September of 2023. Now, a number of different polling firms have come together in compiling all of this data here. A notable one here, Race to the White House, which we typically use to track GOP primary polling when that was relevant. We take a look at it when it comes down to Senate elections and forecasts of elections. But ultimately, they provide us the most 30 recent polls when it comes down to the presidential election, and they compile them together. And what they do here is taking a look at the national average, which shows Joe Biden with roughly a 0.5% advantage over Donald Trump, a lead for the first time in months. Now, The Economist also does something very similar, where right now they are showing a tie, different from what they've been showing again for the past couple of months, that have been showing Donald Trump with the upper hand against Joe Biden. The only major compilation of polls here that differs from this is Real Clear Politics, which has yet to update their poll, including the most recent one from the Morning Consult. I was interested to see that they included the regular voter sample and not the likely voter sample. They often do differentiate depending on the poll, but interestingly enough, it was that individual poll that has been keeping Donald Trump with the upper hand. Had they switched it out with the Biden +2 number that really has been circulating very far and wide here, Joe Biden would have a lead of 0.2% on the average. So it's very interesting to see the decisions being made here. I'm not really trying to insinuate anything, but I will say that there is often times where Real Clear Politics does tend to lean to the right when it comes down to how they compile polls and really who their target audience is. And so I want to keep that in mind. I very much do respect all the work that they do, but fundamentally, it's not necessarily entirely unbiased when it comes down to how they're doing their data and what they're presenting to the general public. With that being said, though, the numbers are clear here. Joe Biden has taken back a lead in many different metrics. And it isn't just polling data that we're starting to see a reversal on the national average at least. You're starting to see it in swing states, states like Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania, where the reversal away from Donald Trump's lead that has been growing and growing. You know, along the past couple of months, Donald Trump didn't have this large of a lead back in September or November, even quite frankly, January. And so you're starting to see it come back home for Democrats in some of these states. All of it really is coming at the perfect time for President Biden to ramp up the general election season. With both of the candidates declared as their nominees, it means it's only until the convention that it actually becomes official, but they know that they're going to be their respective party nominees. This general election season has certainly taken really everybody by a storm. It's starting off very early on, and interestingly enough too, I think because we've seen Biden really pump out a number of ads, spend tens of millions of dollars across battleground states, across the national media markets, you are finding that the Biden campaign is seeing a direct benefit of that level of, really hounding on voters and getting them to acknowledge that this is general election season and that this is Biden versus Trump. Now, what I want to take a look at isn't just the national numbers, but what it might mean for the Electoral College this coming November. We've been talking a lot about the 2020 presidential election. We've discussed how Joe Biden won by 4.5% on the national popular vote here, and you have to replicate something similar, at least that was the conventional wisdom prior to the 2022 midterms, but that you have to replicate something similar in order to win as a Democrat. People remember that in 2016, Hillary Clinton also won the popular vote by 2.1% and yet lost the Electoral College. Keep in mind, Republicans have not won the popular vote any time in the 21st century except for the 2004 presidential election. And so looking at our 2016 election results here, Democrats were making the argument that any Democrat moving forward would have to go above and beyond. It wasn't just about winning the popular vote. It didn't always coincide with the general election, even in ways that it did with Barack Obama in 2008 and 2012. You needed to win by more. And so Joe Biden did. When he won by 4.5%, he actually won the states that mattered, Wisconsin, Arizona, and Georgia, the three closest states of the presidential election that also, had they gone to Donald Trump, would have tipped, the results of the election into 4 more years for Donald Trump here. And so Georgia, which Biden won by 0.24, Wisconsin, which Biden won by 0.63, and Arizona, which Biden won by 0.31. Across these 3 states, it was 44,000 votes that made the difference and that landed Joe Biden the presidency. And had 44,000 voters, or I guess 44,001 voters voted differently here, you would have found that President Trump would have been reelected. And so ultimately, the 4.5% translated into victories across these states. It's reasonable to conclude that had Joe Biden won the popular vote by maybe 3 percentage points, that would have been slightly enough of a benefit for Donald Trump that he would have been able to win re-election. I no longer believe that is the case. The 2022 midterms were a very interesting set of midterm elections because it defied our conventional wisdom about the national popular vote and what it meant to be a red or blue wave year. Going into 2022, President Biden had a very low approval rating. He had an approval rating of roughly 45%, depending on the poll, and 45% was the high end here. He had approval ratings that were worse than Obama in 2010 and 2014, and yet Obama suffered significantly more defeats when it came down to House and Senate elections. Congressional elections, even gubernatorial elections in both of those midterm elections, I can just show you here for visualization. 2008 Democrats had 257 seats in the House. By 2010, it was 193. One of the largest amount of pickups for Republicans in over 50 years, 63 seats gained, and President Biden's approval rating was lower than President Obama's, and yet Democrats just lost 10 seats. And the reason for that was largely about the issue of abortion. It was largely about things that Republicans simply couldn't message on correctly, couldn't win in many of these states and districts because of these issues. And so I think it really came down to the fact that voters, despite disapproving of President Biden, disapproving of the Democratic Party, in fact, in some cases, disapproving of the candidates that were on their ballot, still voted for the incumbents here because they believed that they would align with them on key and crucial issues like abortion that mattered to voters at the time and still very much matter to voters today. The 2022 midterms proved when Republicans won the national popular vote by 2.8%, that Democrats could win Pennsylvania by 5, that Democrats could win Arizona by 5, that Democrats could win in Georgia and Nevada and New Hampshire, despite it being an 11-point swing from 2018, despite it being an 8-point swing since 2020. These swings here would suggest entirely otherwise from what the results actually predicted. And if you look back at my own prediction, I was operating under the assumption that Democrats would do marginally better than what was expected of them. And yet they did significantly better, which is why President Biden has a much better shot at re-election than many of us think. Fundamentally, these polls here do indicate one thing, that President Biden is making improvements, but they don't suggest that Donald Trump is a shoo-in for this election. Would it have suggested that back in 2020? Absolutely. Even in 2016, these numbers would be way too close for any major pundit to have predicted a Hillary Clinton victory in these states or across the national, because it really didn't make sense. She was up on the national average, but she was up in battleground states by significantly higher margins. Today, that is where Trump does well. Again, we've seen improvements for Joe Biden, but that isn't to say that this election is a done deal for President Biden, and I don't want that to come across that way at all. This is still very much a close election, but Biden is making improvements, and it matters to these key and crucial states. Remember those 6 that we talked about: Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Arizona, Georgia, Nevada. Now let's throw in North Carolina, because that's probably going to be another swing state, so now we're at a total of 7. 93 electoral votes that will probably make or break this nation, and I think it's going to be very interesting to see exactly what these states do this coming November 5th. Because based on where President Biden is, and based on the improvements that we are seeing, I think we could very well see a similar map to the 2020 presidential election, if not a carbon copy of the 2020 presidential election. And I know that may be something that we really take problem with. American elections are supposed to be interesting. They're not meant to have repeat candidates. They're meant to be things that are fun and engaging and things that we can predict or maybe not predict. But this election probably is going to be one that, in hindsight, was so easy to expect and predict because of who these candidates were. And the national averages shifting now really isn't helping that. But on the political analysis front, with President Biden leading in the national average, it significantly improves his chances at winning in states like Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. And uniquely enough, Michigan back in the 2020 presidential election, based on analysis, was the state that replicated America to a T. Although President Biden did win the national popular vote by a larger margin, the percentage at which he received in the state was roughly similar to the percentage that Joe Biden received nationally. And taking a look at demographics, taking a look at the money spent, and taking a look at just overall the investments from both sides, whether that came down to not only the presidential race, but Senate races, House races here. Michigan was at the front of it all. And it has voted with the presidential election winner in 2008, 2012, 2016, 2020, and it might again in 2024. And it is so uniquely interesting because in 2022, in the way that it was right in 2020, in 2022, shifted in a way that we saw many other states do. And when it had an abortion referendum on the ballot, nearly mimicked the national average in terms of who is pro-choice and who is pro-life. And so this will be an interesting case study for the 2024 election. But with the numbers improving for President Biden, knowing what we know about Michigan, replicating largely what we see on the national average here, chances are Michigan is shifting blue as well. And that's what the polls are suggesting too. Because it isn't just the national averages shifting towards Biden and the statewide averages shifting towards Trump. That's not where we are, and that's really not where we're going to be this coming November. But the numbers are getting better for Biden, and I think it really matters. Because this rarely happens. At least over the past couple of months, it just simply hasn't been happening here. Even on Real Clear Politics, you can see at different points in time, Donald Trump had a 4-point advantage over Joe Biden, a 4.3% advantage on January 27th, 2024. Genuinely speaking, had the election been held on January 27th, Donald Trump probably would have won every single battleground state. But clearly, the Biden campaign is clawing their way back. They're fighting their way back to an advantage on the national average, and it is just a matter of time that at least on Real Clear Politics that it happens, and across many other major polling compilation firms, that this happens as well. And so Biden should expect, in full honesty, potentially some better numbers. I think we're going to see improvements not only on the national, but maybe some leads now in some of these battleground states. I was surprised to see most recently, we can actually see this on Real Clear Politics, in Wisconsin, that one of the most recent polls found here was a tie from the Wall Street Journal. I think Wisconsin is a state that I think Democrats have been very worrisome about because in 2016, Clinton was up by 7. In 2020, Biden was up by 7. And yet in both instances, they were decided by less than a point in 2016 in favor of Trump and 2020 in favor of Biden. But then in 2022, they said Tim Michels, the Republican, would win. And they also said that Ron Johnson was going to win by 5 to 6 points. And yet on election day, the polls were wrong by 4 to 5 points in favor of Democrats. And then on the Senate level, equally. And so I think it threw Democrats for a loop because they looked at this and they said, this doesn't make sense. Wisconsin has been continuously the state that we simply can't get right in terms of polling averages. And it seems as if they always underestimate Donald Trump. That does not seem to be the case today. And based on the numbers that we're seeing here, Biden has seen improvements regardless. Donald Trump used to lead in this state by more. He used to be up in the advantage point and really was at a point where it didn't seem like Joe Biden was going to have a poll at all come out that showed him in the advantage. But in the time between February and March, you can even see it here. Bloomberg and Morning Consult released a poll back in February saying Trump was up by 4 and now Biden is up by 1. A 5-point swing in roughly a month. Now, the Hill and Emerson did show an improvement for Donald Trump in that same month. And so really, this is all very interesting. I think I look at this and I think that it's much more close to the average than maybe what a Trump plus 4 lead would say or anything that shows Biden up by more than a percentage point. But it's interesting because Wisconsin is going to be a state that matters. And I think with a national change, with improvements on the national level, Wisconsin will start to come home. As many people start to realize that this is a repeat of the 2020 presidential election, we start to realize that people revert to their priors. That's why states like New Hampshire were also very good indicators about how the rest of the country might go. Because in New Hampshire right now, you see that Donald Trump is losing to Joe Biden by around 7 percentage points. And I know that may be something that is surprising. And I think it is for many people because across many of the other states, you are seeing here that Donald Trump has made significant improvements since the 2020 presidential election. But of all of the battleground states, to have seen Donald Trump and Joe Biden's presence most heavily. And Joe Biden didn't even visit the state of New Hampshire, but the writing campaign there was very, very strong and heavy. And it was at the start of the primary season. Republicans were fighting for that state. Democrats were fighting for that state in their own party primaries. And so that state got to realize that this was a repeat election. It's a state with a very significant number of Nikki Haley supporters, a lot larger than the rest of the population here across the country, but a lot of Democrats were the reason why Nikki Haley did so well in the New Hampshire primary here. Regardless, though, New Hampshire was in the general election season for a very long period of time. They were in this presidential election 6 months before any of the other swing states. And so for many of those voters, they've recognized that this is a Trump versus Biden rematch, and they're voting nearly identical to how they did back in the 2020 presidential election. It also just so happens to be that New Hampshire is one of the whitest states in the country, meaning it doesn't have that bleed that Democrats are experiencing in states like Georgia amongst black voters or Arizona amongst Latino voters. But again, you're starting to see a reversal on that as well. And so when those things come together and the 2020 presidential election is brought back together, this winning coalition that took everybody took everybody. I mean, it was not going to be won without any specific minority group or any specific advocacy group. It was a winning coalition for a reason and still only won by 44,000 votes across these battleground states, but it is certainly coming back. And whether you see it happening on the statewide level or you see it happening on the national level, one thing is assured. The numbers here are improving for President Biden. And should they continue, as they have been now for weeks on end, they indicate that President Biden is on a track for victory this coming November 5th. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.